Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay.
New College Faculty Conversations.
Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay, the faculty podcast of New College of Florida. My name is Douglas Estes. I'm the Associate Professor of Religion here at New College.
And I'm Dr. Bruce Gilley. I am the Presidential Scholar in Residence here at the New College. You're probably wondering who our guest is today. Well, it is none other than our fellow host on this podcast, Dr. Alicia Mercado-Harvey, who is Assistant Professor of Spanish and History here at the New College and a sometime author of exciting novels in Spanish. So we're very welcome to have you here. Nice to be here, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you know me as the host, right? So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what I do. I am, as you said, a fiction writer, and I'm also I have my PhD in literature. But I did combine MA, BA, MA in history, and that's why I, teach history courses here as well. So,
and how did you end up at the New College? Because I think you're originally from Chile, so yes. That's quite a lot of latitudes to get up here.
Exactly, yes, a long way from here. Well, I moved to Sarasota 23 years ago. And 24 years ago. And, at the time, I wasn't really sure. I went into teaching. I knew that I wanted to teach, so I went into teaching Spanish. And pretty quickly, middle schoolers taught me that this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I decided to go into to USF to get my master's in Spanish, which was a really happy experience. Really I learned a lot there, and I loved being back in school. My long-term plan was always get a PhD in history, but along the way, things changed a little bit, and then I went into literature, and then I decided to go on into UF, into a program for Spanish and Portuguese, because I also had always had a love for the Portuguese language and culture, in Brazil in particular. And so I decided to, given that they had a good program at UF, I decided to go into that.
Great. Before we talk about your fiction, you have a book that just came out this year in the nonfiction or research category. I am not speaker of Spanish, so I will let you pronounce the title.
Right. So it's Crímenes Dictatoriales. It has a long title, but I, refer to the short one, and tell you a little bit what it's about.
Please.
So this is kind of an interesting thing that I started working on fiction as detective, as the genre. Like my two novels are detective fiction. So that kind of prompted me. My mother was a huge fan of detective fiction, more than me, in fact. And that's what, created El Cajón del Cóndor. That's my first novel that I co-wrote with her. She's a journalist and very interested in political issues. She was a political journalist and a TV personality. And so, we did that novel, and then I decided to start after she passed away, in a way to process grief. The novel La Muerte no tiene traducción is what came from that period. And as I was working on the novel, on the first one, El Cajón del Cóndor, it's when I started putting the pieces together of doing, this is the dissertation, it came out of my dissertation research, where I started seeing all these parallels between societies that were post-dictatorial, like in this case, Chile, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil, started seeing all these parallels between the literatures and how they all had some fiction where you have a detective that explores the dictatorial past through a crime. So, when you start seeing those things that you can connect together, that's perfect for, exploring and doing research on it. So
great.
Yeah.
It is a great example of history and literature, right? That literature often reflects or tries to think about history, and history then sometimes often borrows upon this literature for its movements, its ideas. And you've picked a particularly potent area where history and literature collide, which is the way that literature processes historical wounds, traumas, dictatorial, all kinds of things. I'm a specialist in China. There was a huge genre that was called wound literature that came out after the death of Mao Zedong, dealing with the crimes of the Mao Zedong dictatorship, not like Latin American ones, but other types. So is what drew you to this the sort of universality of this type of genre? Obviously, you had experienced it personally in your mom's life, but just seems there's a lot of scope for this topic to go for a whole career.
Right. Well, I mean, like I said, I went into detective fiction because of the interests that, my mother had, and I started really getting, my go into detective fiction was different from her. She went into all the classics, the Agatha Christie, the Sherlock Holmes, all that. And I went into detective fiction when I discovered Bolaño. Bolaño to me, it's like an enormous figure in literature. And I figured that he had used fiction, in detective fiction in particular, in the way that Borges had mapped it out. And I'm a big reader and lover of Borges literature. So all those things kind of drew me into it. And when I saw the political dimension into it, it's when I thought, well, this really could, and no one had said it, which was the other interesting thing. There's been a lot of publications on trauma literature. And a lot of it is about Gothic, about terror, about different genres of literature. Toni Morrison has been analyzed, Stephen King as trauma literature, but I didn't see any studies done on detective fiction. So that's when I thought, well, this is a, fertile ground to do something and say something novel. So
what's interesting about what you're saying to me is that as somebody who was born and raised in North America, when I think of detective fiction, I think of cop shows on TV, or more comedy or humor than real drama. But what you're talking about is far more on the dramatic side, especially when you're dealing with some currents of South America. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it all actually comes out of the noir genre in the United States. Dashiell Hammett, you have Raymond Chandler. So that's the vein that Latin American literature took in terms of saying, well, the state is corrupt, so we have this independent detective going and doing investigations. So that's kind of where that comes from. Of course, this is postmodern detective fiction, which is more, if you're familiar with like Paul Auster, New York Trilogy, that's sort of questioning everything around you. There are no certainties in postmodernity. So it's kind of that kind of a detective fiction where, there's a lot of doubt. There's really no resolution of crimes because, I mean, when you have the state doing the crime, how are you going to have a resolution? That's not possible. So it's all those elements that, seem to fit together and, very good for thinking about it and finding new angles,
Yeah.
So if you're a complete outsider to Latin American literature, as I am, I mean, I would name Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Borges, Vargas Llosa, and maybe Isabel Allende, although she's kind of Americanized. But I mean, those are four people who I know and I've read. But the thing that, if you say Latin American literature to me, the first thing that pops into my mind is magical realism, yes. Right? This is what made it famous. This is how it got going. So now you're introducing me to another genre here. Is there any interaction between these two? Is there magical realism in the detective novels?
No, in fact, very much the contrary. And I'm going to kind of go back to the area, the era that you're talking about, which is the boom, right? When in the 60s, 70s, where Vargas Llosa and Garcia Marquez were big. But there's also Cortázar, this Argentine writer who's part of the boom. And Cortázar is actually very much into a different kind of literature. He was a visionary in the sense of thinking of Latin American literature as urban, as the same than European literature or American literature, without having this sort of inferiority complex, like we have to, we talk about Latin American literature with the exotic, and that comes from the time of colonization. I was just talking to a student about this. The first letters from Columbus, Pero Vais de Camilla, it's all about the exotic birds, the fauna, the all this exotic nature. And that is precisely what we see in magical realism. While, Cortázar mapped the way for, in Borges to a point too, to say, no, I mean, our literature can be coming out of universal literature. Borges was the first one doing that, saying, because he was commenting on things that have philosophical themes, everything to do with Greek and Roman literature, like ancient classics. And so this was a different way of doing literature. Cortázar continued that, and then Bolaño, which is this other writer that I'm mentioning now, who is like the biggest Latin American writer, right now that people are reading and commenting about and doing studies on. he was the same way, and he was a very transnational writer because he was born in Chile like me, but he lived most of his life in Catalonia in Spain. Lived sometime in Mexico as well, where he actually did most of his readings and the formative years for a writer. But he ended up living in Spain, and so in talking about universal literature. So, but also about Latin America. So it's that, the literature in Latin America today is very much globalized, very
So
different.
you're saying it's contrastive, actually. It's almost like a rebuke to the exoticization of magical realism. It says, no, we're going to have gritty urban cop
Correct.
shows too. That shows that we're great because we can do gritty urban cop shows as well. And none of this,
Yes.
beautiful woman feeding the chickens and
Yes.
turning into a pelican halfway through her feeding. That's exoticization.
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
Yes, because it's also showing a reality. Most people today in Latin America live in big cities. They live in Santiago and Bogota, Lima, not in the little countryside towns. It's the same phenomenon that we're happening in Europe, in the United States. So it's reflecting the same reality of globalization.
As a form of postmodern literature, then, you're writing, do you engage in things like unreliable narrators and, oh, yeah, okay, please, yes.
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of the fiction that I study, they have a very, very unreliable narrators. In fact, in one of the novels that I love from Rubén Fonseca, August, that is about the Getúlio Vargas dictatorship in Brazil that was in the 30s, and then commenting on the military dictatorship that happened then in the 60s and 70s in Brazil. It's so unreliable that, our detective dies at the end at the hand of the criminal, and we as readers know before. So it's reversing the genre of detective fiction completely upside down, where the detective doesn't know he's going to be killed, but the reader does, which is really exciting too, because as a reader, you know what's going to happen. Right. You're trying to yell at the character, do something,
right.
And nope, he gets killed. So
right. Very good.
Yeah.
Is it the case that there's always, in some ways, a tension between wanting to engage with universal themes and grittiness and the reality of every place versus branding literature or finding the exotic precisely because, if nothing else, the exotic sells?
Yes. Well, I think that is a big and interesting point, because I think that for a long time, Latin America was sold in this sort of cookie cutter model of, it started with Garcia Marquez, who's, Cien Años de Soledad. It's like a fantastic novel. Everybody should read it. But they should not end there. That's a starting point. And that's a side of Latin America that exists, is real. In fact, Garcia Marquez says that he told a lot of the stories were told by his grandmother. These are like stories that he heard as a child. And then he made into this fantastic novel. But, there's so much more to Latin America that this other side, urban and, global, and even with our own things that are very idiosyncratic to us, in Latin America, but with more of this context of urban, dark side, all this.
I think of that because I was once at a talk given by Margaret Atwood at Oxford. Margaret Atwood, the famous Canadian novelist. And Margaret Atwood has written a lot that is somewhat exotic about Canada. It's in the wintry areas. There's trappers, there's Mounties, there's Inuit, snow-covered, splotches of blood in the snow. And someone asked her, now, why don't you write more about the gritty urban experience of homeless drug addicts in Toronto? Because that's really the reality of Canada today. And her answer was, because nobody would read it.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think that I don't think that's actually true. I think that people will read that kind of stuff. It's just probably it doesn't interest her. And why? I mean, she's a fantastic writer. This particular stuff she writes in science fiction is fascinating. And so, I understand that we all have different interests of what we want to write about.
But it's not what she knows also. Right? And this is what you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. It's what, and this is one thing that they always tell to writers, which is very true. Write about what you know, which it doesn't mean, this also got taken the wrong way, of writing your autobiography. For a while, this thing of like your own story was, oh my gosh, so boring to me. I feel like, you have to write about the reality that you know. that doesn't mean that, if you're going to write about science fiction, about robots necessarily, or, planets, but it's imagining things based on knowledge that you have, because even science fiction really is about realities of today, or things that we're living, not really about the future, I mean, some things are, but it's commenting on society in general.
How do you feel that being an author and a professor interact in the classroom? And let me ask it this way. My minor in college was French. And I think back, I had wonderful faculty, but everything we read was classic, French literature. It wasn't anything like I would call up to date or anything like that. How's it impact? What do students feel?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just going to do an ISP in creative writing this January. This was a suggestion of the provost at the time. He said, well, if you come with this background, why don't you try this? And I thought, well, I've never done it. But I've taken enough literary workshops that I know how to do one. And it will be great, because I'm also exposing the students to writers from Latin America who do conversations with them via Zoom. So that's going to be also exposing the students to that. But to your question about how this, interacts with what I assign, for example, for readings, definitely it makes a difference, because you're right. When you're an academic, a lot of times you study the classics and you kind of stay in that lane, but there's so much more literature that is happening. For me, it's important as a fiction writer to know what my colleagues are doing, and I read very up-to-date things. So when I find things that are really good, I will definitely assign them, in my classes. So definitely has an influence.
Great. It's again coming back to this question of how do you strike the balance? Because I would say Don Quixote is an incredibly exoticized magical realist account, yet it's from Spain and it's old, and it's a great book too. So you would think that the books of the past are realistic accounts of everyday life, and that they're dealing with kind of universal themes. But this is a weird kind of Spanish magical realist novel of, I don't know how old it is, 300 years old.
Yeah,
So,
it's from the 16th century, the
so
first part of the book.
Presumably you can assign books from the past, even great books from the past, that are weird and wacky as anything that you might assign from today.
Right. Well, it's good that you bring Don Quixote up, because this is a very interesting novel. It's the first modern novel. It's considered the first modern novel. And to the point of the magical realism, the interesting thing is that Cervantes was actually commenting and mocking, making fun of that medieval literature that was all about dragons. He was so the things that he's putting in the book are actually meant to be parody. And it's a very complex book. It's this metafiction, intertext, all the features that we think today of postmodern novel, they were all in El Quijote. I mean, nothing really has been invented, really, like novelty after this masterpiece. It's like in theater, what's been invented after Shakespeare? It's all, the same. So you're building on that, but it's such a foundational work of universal literature, because it's very influential, obviously, in the Spanish language, but we find plenty of American writers, European writers, very influenced by Cervantes. So there's all these interactions.
Even to the point that Graham Greene's last great novel was called Don Quixote, and it was basically a modern, updated version of the story of Don Quixote.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of that been done. Borges also had a story about rewriting, Don Quixote. So it's a theme that's a lot in literature in general. Paul Auster also has in the New York trilogy also appears Don Quixote, characters from Don Quixote. So. Mm-hmm.
So when you think about your classes, do you have a favorite class? Do you have a class that you are really interested in wanting to be able to teach? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I have obviously my favorite that comes from my research on transatlantic detective fiction. And It's something that I'm hoping to teach as a seminar for great books, because detective fiction also has, great books. And so it's something that I taught as an ISB years ago, and I think that it would be really good as a full semester class. So I think that would definitely be favored. But I love all the classes that I teach, really, because I love teaching languages. I enjoy that. I love teaching Portuguese, which is something I've done here in the past as tutorials. And I didn't answer now, segue to your question of how I got here. Well, I lived here for a long time, so I kept applying for jobs to New College every time one opened. and out of persistence, after 10 years,
Yay.
one opened up and they, yes, that's how. But going back, so I have taught also Portuguese, which I love. I love teaching literature in language, Spanish language. In history, it's also a passion of mine. You were mentioning all this intersection between literature and history. And one of the things that I do in my classes is that I assign literature. Students also watch films in my surveys. And so there's an interaction between the history and the literature in, all sorts of poetry, different things that I have in my classes. So.
Are there some distinctions between Spanish literature, and I'm thinking of Chile, and Portuguese literature, and I'm thinking of Brazil? Like, how would there be any differences there?
There are a lot of things in common. I mean, they're written in different languages, of course, but there are a lot of things in common, particularly with Brazilian and other Latin American countries. There's a lot of connections in there, the same way that there are connections between Portuguese literature from Portugal with Spanish literature. So there are connections, but both worlds, have different traditions too, and idiosyncrasies that
Right.
come, in the literature.
Right. But they both come from the American noir, right?
Oh, you're talking specifically about the detective fiction and those.
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Yes, the detective fiction all comes in Latin America very much from the noir. I mean, the noir was something that captured the attention of writers, and they created their own detectives on that vein. In fact, in Chile, we have Heredia, who is a detective very much out of the Raymond Chandler tradition. And it's, the longest detective series in Chilean literature. Like this year, the 20th of that series of book got published by Ramon Díaz Otero, which is like our biggest writer of that genre, of the noir.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And do you teach in history as well? Because you say Spanish and history, so are those sort of two different disciplines? You teach classes in both sides?
Exactly. Yes, I am in the humanities division, but I also teach for the history, which is in social sciences. So my classes are listed as history. I have 4 actually that I teach. I have a survey of Latin America, which is like from colonial to revolutionary Latin America. The first part, which I'm ending now, and next semester I'll be teaching the modern and contemporary Latin America. I also have a class on Brazil, contemporary Brazil, so it's 20th, 21st century. And I have one that's dictatorships of the Iberian Peninsula, which is focused particularly on Franco and Salazar, the 20th century, the longest Western dictatorships. So.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about New College, because so many of our faculty are highly interdisciplinary. And so we drift into other areas. I mean, I do biblical studies, but I also drift into literature. And, you're doing Spanish, but also drift into history and drift into creative writing. It's great.
Yeah, and I think especially if your specialty in Spanish literature is the ways in which the literature is picking up on historical themes and processing those themes, and then maybe in turn, being influential in how history is dealing with it, in fact, then that's tremendous. I mean, I know in all the memory movements in Latin America, so much of that sense of solidarity came out of reading, sharing stories of the sort that literature was doing. So it's almost essential for you to be teaching in history if you're going to be researching the literature of history.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is something that David Ellis brought last time we had a conversation, the intersections. He was a political scientist, but he was saying history is so important. As a literature person, I say most of my colleagues really ignore the history. And it's because they were taught that way, because the trend in the 90s, the 2000s was very much forget about the author, forget about the context. And to me, that never made sense. And so I found, as I was doing my studies in graduate school, the one professor that actually understood where I was going, and that history played a big part in explaining what the literature of those countries. I mean, how could you take it out of the context of the dictatorship and that's what they're talking about? So I think that, it makes more sense, in my view, bigger picture. And people actually are interested in literature because of those things, not because of what critic A says about, psychoanalysis or this or the other, which is completely disconnected. And people are not reading literary criticism anymore because of that, because it's just, for people outside of academia, is nonsense. And I think having a more historical, grounded interpretation people can understand that,
Right.
can
This
relate
is,
to
this
that.
is telling us about something that reflected some reality, and this is
Right.
Correct.
And sometimes fiction can be a more accurate rendering of the reality because it's not constrained by archival sourcing and stuff, but often it feels more authentic as history than an actual history.
Yeah, and there are other colleagues of ours doing this. I know Will, who's teaching in American history. He teaches a class in Vietnam where he's teaching novels. He's assigning to the students novels to read about Vietnam, and they're learning the history through the novels. So it's, we're kind of in the same, thinking in the same way to teach history.
How do you feel about the idea that literature, especially the type of literature that you engage with, can have a cathartic effect in our lives? And, dealing with trauma, dealing with crimes of the state against people. What do you think?
Yes, I think that is a big part and why this literature is so important and people connect to it, because it has that cathartic, absolutely. In fact, I say in my book that writing this literature is so important for people to read it because it's a way of processing. Because in the way of reading, they're discovering the past and reliving the past in a way and coming to some form of a closure. And it's something that really I'm passionate about so much that my next book is going to be also on trauma literature. But I will in this time not leave the detective fiction for a while and just analyze Chilean literature of people who, like me, were born, already under the dictatorship and, lived through as children and adolescents. And so this literature has certain marks that I find very interesting in films also. I'm doing film and literature of the period, and I'm going to continue with the trauma literature.
In our last couple of minutes together, tell us a little bit about the mechanics of going into one of your classes. Does a student have to be fluent in Spanish? Sounds like if I had some basic Spanish, I'd love to take your class, but I'd be afraid that I'd be out of my depth because everyone would be fluent.
It depends on the class, and the way that we do it here in New College, like many places, if you come with previous knowledge, you're taking an AP and IB class, you can test into the class that, you should be at. If you have no knowledge of Spanish, you should not be intimidated. We do our best to be entertaining and teach you the best way possible, so you'll actually make connections with real life. And a lot of students come with no knowledge, and they end up continuing classes, do 4 semesters or 3 semesters. A lot of times that's a requirement from other disciplines. So no, you should definitely not be intimidated. You'll be at the right level. If you come to a new college, you'll test into the correct level. So.
Well, we've been speaking today with Dr. Alicia Mercado-Harvey. We're so thankful that you could be with us today.
And as we always say,
Go Mighty Banyans!